Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. Gentlemen, Bob, Phil, it is absolutely fantastic to have the two of you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome to the podcast.
Guy, thank you so much. We've been looking forward to this UK experience, let's put it that way. And we've heard a lot about you, and we're very excited to be talking with you today.
I know who you are. I can see, for those of you that are listening and not watching, of course, I can see the book that you had in front of you as well, which we're going to definitely start talking about. But just for people that don't know who you are, obviously I do because I've invited you on, it'd be great if you'd introduce yourselves.
So I'll start. My name is Bob DeCook. I'm in this collaborative effort between Phil and I. I'm the corporate guy. I'm the corporate executive side of the team, and I've come up through a number of different companies in management and executive roles, the practitioner, so to speak. And I've been fortunate enough a long time ago, almost 30 years ago, to get to know and work with and hire early Phil Clampett, who's worked with me and who then we've worked together to write two previous books, several articles, and now this, what we're calling a capstone book, which we're very, very excited about and excited to talk to you about. So that's me.
And I'm Phil Clampett. I'm the academic side of this. I'm a university professor here at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay. And my expertise has been around organizational communication, leadership, and information science, and kind of bring a different lens to the same kind of issues that Bob has been dealing with in the corporate world. And so we have almost exactly the same kinds of interests in terms of issues, but we bring two different perspectives. And I think that's been kind of the secret to our success of looking at an issue from slightly different angles and then trying to synthesize and collaborate those perspectives. And so that's why the partnership, I think, has lasted so long. And, it's been really a great experience. So,
first of all, just give us the name of the book that we're really going to put some energy and focus into, and then I'm going to start asking the many questions I have for you.
All right, so the name of the book is Leading with Care in a Tough World, and the subtitle is Beyond Servant Leadership. So all three of those little stopping points, the Leading with Care, Tough World to Do It In, Beyond Servant Leadership, are three important cornerstones of this book.
Just that dynamic of an academic and an executive, which is just a beautiful joining. Is it an easy connection? Did it have its moments of vibration?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the first time I met Bob, I was a young professor, and I was feeling pretty cocky and pretty confident about what I knew, because I had studied with the best people in the world. One of them over in London, actually, as a matter of fact, was one of my, not a mentor, but somebody I studied. And so I was feeling pretty good about what I knew. And when Bob called and asked to meet with us about a survey about communication effectiveness in his organization, I said, well, sure, I'll be happy to be down. And I went down and presented what I thought they should do, et cetera. And then Bob, at the end of that, kind of our presentation, at the end of that, Bob said, well, Phil, or maybe he may even call me Dr. Clampett at that time, and said, or professor, or whatever it was, and he said, what does a world-class communication system look like? And I have no idea how I answered at that time. All I know is it was a terrible answer in my view. I drove home with my partner, then I said, well, I blew that. I had never been asked that question before. And in that way, with that degree of sincerity and that degree of depth. And so we stumbled through that answer, but Bob saw something in me, like he does in a lot of people, and we were able to have a partnership after that, dealing with a lot of those same kinds of issues.
And I would say that that kind of question and that kind of response has happened through our whole collaboration together. And we've respectfully debated and challenged each other from many perspectives. And it's always ended up being a better result. And in these books we've written, and this one in particular, we've been able to share some of that synthesis of the academic and the practice for our readers. So that's the exciting part.
I'd like to pick up on servant leadership, which is a word that will be very familiar to a lot of people. This is a podcast that predominantly focuses on leadership and culture and transformation and development. The idea of servant leadership for some, actually, I notice, especially if they've never been introduced to it before, is still quite a step in terms of just that whole idea of being of service, especially if they come from a more autocratic space. You're saying beyond servant leadership. Why beyond? So maybe if you could just give us a little bit of a lead in and why it's also beyond servant leadership.
Sure, I'll start with that guy. So Greenleaf, who did the original essay on servant leadership, which was a new platform in leadership thinking back in the 70s. He was a AT&T executive, I believe. And he said there's a different way to look at leadership rather than autocratic style, which you mentioned. And it has to do with paying attention to the people and serving the people and helping them with the challenges and the barriers and the things that keep them from being able to perform in a way that develops the people. And that was a big, different idea. And for those who were more command and control, a big step, as you say, and still is a big step for people. When we say beyond servant leadership, we think that we prescribe to all the things that Greenleaf and all of his successors and people who wrote about that and still write about it talk about and espouse. But the beyond part is there's more to it than only serving the people. The other part of it is you have to serve and be attentive to the outcomes of the organization that are the outcomes for the people and the outcomes for, in the case of a for-profit business, for the business or a nonprofit, in the objectives of the business, in a organization or a political arena, the policies and objectives that they're trying to get. And the challenge is you have to serve the people and engage the people in a deep enough way so they understand and get, I'll just use the simple word, juiced up and very motivated about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, so they can engage completely and creatively in helping an organization to achieve them. And we don't think that servant leadership in itself goes far enough on the outcome side. It talks about serving the people, it talks about engagement, but you gotta get the results too. You gotta move the ball, and leaders all over the world are faced with that. They need both, serving the people and the outcomes.
So if I've heard that correctly, if somebody gets maybe a little bit obsessed with this idea of being of service, it could defang them a little bit. It could actually put them into a place where maybe they're taking their eye off the ball with the commercial imperatives. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. There's plenty of examples of that. So much attention to the service part that you take your eye off the ball of the business part or the outcomes part. And you need to have both to be successful. And also the word care, which is also the part of the title of the book, we think is a deeper idea than service. You can say, I'm serving the people or I'm serving the outcomes. But when you say, I deeply care about the people and deeply care about the outcomes, that's more in-depth level of engagement and in-depth commitment to both the people and the objectives.
And I just follow up on that by saying when we talk in my specialty is organizational communication. I always say that every executive, every leader broadcasts on two channels, WIFM and WIFO. What's in it for me and what's in it for the organization? And if all the emphasis is just on WIFM, what's in it for you as an employee or the person in the who's on the other side of that, then I think what happens is people think you're disingenuous because they know that there's a WIFO, what the organization is out there. And I think what Bob and I have tried to do is try to create a balance or how to synthesize those two together. And I always say great leaders and great executives broadcast on both channels, WIFM and WIFO. And that's the way you have to do it to be successful and be genuine about it. And so there's a genuineness that needs to come through. And sometimes, sometimes servant leadership, to be blunt about it, I think oftentimes gets watered down to a kind of a fluffy, emotional type of thing, and it doesn't really engage on both those levels of both what's in it for the organization and what's in it for me.
And there's always a pendulum that's swinging, I think, between balancing the human being and the human doing, and maybe it's like being a parent, you never get it quite right. I think it's probably fair to say that a person that's focusing on their craft recognises that there is a balance, but there is something about the outliers sitting at a place where if you embrace any of these things too much, then they probably take you out of kilter. So if you're too commercial, too autocratic versus two people and too much culture, you talk about pairing beliefs, fundamental skills. So it'd be great just to hear how that balance goes to keep somebody either on track or to develop them so they can hold the hard truths with the human element both at the same time.
What we find, or what we believe, is that many times leaders focus on either the practices that they believe they need to have to be good leaders, or they have a thoughtfulness about what their belief structure is. In the case of those who have the belief structure pretty much in their hand, they don't quite know how to implement it. They don't know how to put those beliefs into practice. And on the other hand, the people who have been working on the practices of leadership, like communications or relationship building or managing pushback or all the other ones that we talk about in the book, they don't have an underlying belief structure that supports them. So they might not have the values or the learning or the embracing of uncertainty that underpins the practices. And we prescribe that there needs to be both the thought process about what their belief structure is, as well as a well-honed set of practices, working together and working back and forth with one another.
So sometimes we see things like, we both have seen, and I've observed in leaders where they have the right sentiments sometimes of servant leadership, but they don't actually know how to practice it. So we trying to address that. But the one that I find more often, in particularly in the environment that I'm in, and oftentimes in universities, is where people have some of the practices, but they don't have the underlying beliefs. And so we end up with something that I've called faux collaboration, where they pretend like they're collaborating with you, but they really aren't. And and then that would manifest itself, and they'll ask questions and do all the things that you're supposed to do in terms of practicing a collaborative environment. But then when it comes to decision making, they never incorporate any of those ideas in any of their decision making and integrate it. So you have a faux collaboration. Short term, it oftentimes works. Long term, it breeds an enormous amount of cynicism in the organization.
That's interesting, isn't it? I have a phrase which is skimmers, which is, when you get a stone and you throw it across the water, it bounces, which is people that are not really getting wet enough in the essence, so they're not really jumping in the pool. They're kind of just doing enough. And that kind of faux collaboration is quite interesting. It has a sense of being there, being present, standing on the outside looking in. It can seem a little bit Machiavellian, but sometimes maybe not with genuine evil intent, but a lack of willingness to contribute, a sense of maybe for some people self-protection. Is it fair to say that at one end you may have people that are faux collaborating because they have their own agendas and they have a kind of Machiavellian intent? Could you be a faux contributor because actually you're quite submissive, you're just agreeing to get by? Would that full spectrum apply?
That's exactly what it's a theatrical dance almost in some ways, because what they're doing is both sides are playing a game that we're listening and we're participating, but they really aren't. So I think what you put your finger on is both sides of it begin to learn the game, and I know what Bob and I have talked about. We want this to be a genuine collaboration where you genuinely integrate ideas from a variety of sources. And it comes down to oftentimes this: will the leader say, I didn't know that and I need to change my opinion, or I thought this and it was wrong and I need to change my opinion? Those are magical moments that are hard for a lot of leaders to say and articulate, to change and shift their opinion as new facts and new perspectives are integrated into the situation. Otherwise, you do end up with what I think you've accurately described in a different way, but I just call it kind of a theatrical dance, and I see it all the time. And over time, what happens is they'll play the game well at the beginning, but then over time it breeds cynicism in the organization, and you cannot make big innovative leaps unless you and do what your organization really needs and maximize the potential of the employees if you don't get out of that cynical loop. And more seasoned employees learn about that if they think if that's the game they're playing as you describe it. And we don't really have what I think you've done. The way you just articulated it is we don't have good language to describe that kind of cynical dance and cynical theater that goes on really on both people's part. But at the end of the day, I think that the leader is the one who has to set the tone for the genuineness. And that's why we start the book and start our approach with embracing uncertainty. You've got to come in as a leader saying, I don't have all the answers. You may have the answers, or nobody in the room may have the answers, but we are all going to collectively find those answers through this discussion. Well, that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, look out, because you're going to do something really cool and really imaginative and really innovative.
I think your metaphor of the skipping stone is really brilliant, because what's important is when the stone hits the water, it's important that you understand what's beneath the water in order to understand the issue more deeply. And if you continue to skip as a leader from one belief or thought to another without the deeper understanding, people see that immediately. They see the lack of depth. They see the lack of concern. Or if it's them involved themselves, they see the lack of caring. And that fosters the cynicism about the leadership style and approach. And sometimes what happens then is that the reaction of the leader when that dynamic starts to happen is they go back to, well, I know what the answer is, and I'll just tell you what to do. And that's not what the people are looking for. They're looking for an opportunity to contribute their own thoughts and have their own ideas incorporated into a better solution. And that's where it takes this idea that the leader has to embrace the uncertainty of all these different ideas in order to synthesize them and help the group synthesize them into a better solution.
There's a lot going on in what we've just said there, and So there's something very powerful here about communication I'm hearing coming from you, and collaboration. I think I also heard you, Phil, talk about complexity that you can find yourself in. And people say effective communication, and it's such an easy, almost flippant thing to say. You've got to be an effective communicator. And people go, especially when I'm working with senior executives, they go, well, Guy, I haven't got here by accident. So what does effective communication mean to somebody that probably has some proof, or at least the belief, that they must be an effective communicator, because look at where they are in the hierarchy and what they've achieved. So what does effective communication mean to somebody at that level to maybe bring them challenge in that space?
Well, let me start with the outcome measure. I've surveyed probably well over 10,000 employees, and the number one predictor of whether or not an organization or a project is moving in the right direction is, and you can look at this from a data standpoint, is a question of, I'm satisfied with the communication from my supervisor or with my supervisor. And if that particular question, you can ask lots of questions, if that particular question is not looking good, then everything else goes south. So starting with that, as a basis, and then moving backwards, say, well, what is effective communication? Well, I've devoted my entire career, and Bob and I have, in some ways, have devoted all our work together on that very question. So you schedule about 5 more podcasts on this guy, and we'll figure that out. But I can tell you all of it. So if I had to boil it down, I think one of the things that Bob does that's absolutely brilliant is the basis of effective communication in an organization are one-on-one relationships through coaching and developing. So I think you have to start from a relationship boundary, and remember what I said is the number one predictor of effectiveness, in terms of where the organization is going, which is the outcomes you want, is the relationship with the immediate supervisor. So I think the foundation of effective communication is always that one-on-one relationship, and that you have with the direct reports that you have. So that would be the first thing I'd put on a list is to say, we're effective in organizational communication when we have solid relationships between the supervisors and employees, if you're looking at those types of, or if it's a nonprofit, between the partners and the leadership team. The second thing I would say is something I just mentioned was the WIFM and WIFO, that I think that you have to broadcast on both channels. What's in it for me and what's in it for the organization. And if you're not broadcasting on both channels, then you're probably not being successful or successful as you should be. And the third part that I would say is to regularly assess the effectiveness of your communication, whether it's interpersonally or whether it's organizationally. And I always look at effective communication as a loop. It's not A to B as much as you're going from A to B and then you're checking that you've communicated effectively and then moving forward, because it takes a lot more time to see if you're effective. In fact, I was talking to an MBA class about this yesterday. One of my tests of effective communication on a one-on-one basis and even a large basis is you don't necessarily want people singing off the same sheet of music. What you want is people rhyming with your music. If they are rhyming with your music, that is, anybody can learn to say what you just said. A parrot can do that. But you want people to rhyme and be in the same ballpark and say it in different words, in their own words, to interpret it. And that's the way I look at whether or not it's effective or not. So we could go on, but those are 3 kind of tips I would suggest in terms of managing those.
I would add a little bit to that and go back to the example you gave of the executive who believes that they've got to this point because they are good communicators. And that is the case in a lot of cases. That is a true statement. And we can all get better. That's also a true statement. But I think the other couple of filters that are important to look at is, as an individual executive, is to say, not believe that I've got to communicate about everything, but I got to communicate about the things that matter to the people in the organization, the WIFM and WIFO. But you have to select out of the whole group of things that you could talk about, what are the things that really matter to move the ball for the people and for the mission? And really use multiple channels, both, public speaking channels, written channels, electronic channels, video, all kinds of different media to illustrate your point. And the other thing I would say is you can look at the communication experience of the executive or of the vice president or whoever it is and say, well, they're very good at it. But that's not the only source of information in an organization. People look to their first line supervisors or managers as the primary source of information. So part of your job as the chief executive or the middle level executive is to try to help, is to definitely help, not try to help, but make sure that the people who are leading other people all the way through the organization are getting better at communications all the time. Because that network of information that comes down from the chief executive's proclamation or has to be duplicated and replicated in an authentic and truthful way. And I always say, one of the problems with organizational communication is the grapevine is instant. It's also not very accurate a lot of the time. So how do you get the efficiency of a grapevine with the truthfulness and accuracy of the information all the way down? That's the organizational communications challenge on a broader scale.
And Guy, this is a particular passion of mine, so I'll just add one more thought to that, because this is what I devoted my entire career to. But almost every executive I've worked with and leader I've worked with, probably, I'd say 90% of them overestimate the effectiveness of their communication. and the reason why goes to something very deep that I think we've tried to deal with in Leading with Care, is that when an executive or anybody overestimates the quality of their feedback, which goes back to the rhyme versus singing off the same tune, is that they overestimate because they're paying attention to what they say, not paying attention to how other people are interpreting it. So you may say X, Y, and Z, but the grapevine, as Bob just pointed out, may be saying ABC. You need to quickly assess that and make that loop out there. If that misperception is out there, you need to make sure that it's corrected. And you can only do that if you really believe in a receiver orientation towards effective communication as opposed to a sender orientation. And everything, when you started this segment and asking those questions, everything you said were all things that were sender oriented. I learned how to make a great speech. I learned how to write a great memo. All those things are important. I teach them they're important. But you've got to say, well, how are those interpreted? And that's the deeper truth about effective communication in an organization.
I really like that. One of the things I often say when I'm working with senior teams is, when the message leaves the mothership, wherever it may be, what's the final part of its journey? And very often I might get when somebody on the shop floor can understand it or whatever. And, I go, you're nearly there. For me, the answer, and I think I'm really resonating with what you're saying there, is no, it's when you hear it coming back and it's the one you sent out. And so it's not just that it's a single line down to the bottom, but actually it's a circle back to you with you checking in, but not with the same people you gave the message to as to whether or not it's been received. Because even if it hasn't been received well, we have a saying in the UK, which is, well, it used to be the Queen, now we say the King thinks the world smells of paint because there's somebody 3 meters in front of them painting everything. So it's very easy to be told that the message is getting through, but are you actually checking yourself right down at the bottom them rather than relying on that. So I think I'm hearing that full cycle return back to you. How are you checking in? I think I've heard that.
Yeah, you heard that, because that's exactly the language, the way we would describe it. But it's very hard for people to get that in their head. So one of the phrases that we use frequently is harvest the dissent, or somebody else will. So if you can't harvest the misinterpretations that people might have of your message, somebody else will in the grapevine, or somebody else will. So the executive and leaders, people in leadership position, have to know what those are and stay close to the ground to find out what those misimpressions might be. And again, they're not driven by your intentions, they're driven by the interpretations that people have. And so that's a very, very difficult thing to do for people in leadership positions, because usually they are very articulate. Usually they are effective at kind of the one-way flow of communication. Where they have challenges is that second part, like how could they possibly misunderstand what I just said? It was so beautifully said, but it's not. And that's why your description of the loop is the better way to describe effective communication in these environments.
I'll tell you a very short story. That goes back to this story that Phil told about the first presentation he made to me when I asked him about what does world-class communication look like. It's an old story, but I think it's pertinent. And it's very practical. I was running a large manufacturing operation, and it's not important what it was, but the structure of the operation was there were these machines that were very long. I mean, the operators on the machine stretched over 500 or 600 feet along a machine floor. And there was an operator and several hands down the machine, down to the lowest guy on the totem pole, which was way on the other end. And I really wanted everybody to know every day what was going on in the factory, and so I'd write a daily report. And I thought to myself, well, if I give it to the head operator of that machine, he'll certainly share it with his people, and they'll get together and they'll talk about it. And I was really proud of the reports. I started to share them and get them out there. And so I do my Gemba and walk down and talk to the operator. Yeah, I got your report. Then I'd walk down to the next station and the next station. No, we didn't see your report. That guy down on the other end just keeps them down there. He doesn't talk to us. And I go down to the other end of the machine, and they even never even heard that the report was even developed in the first place. So my solution to that world-class communication problem was to give every individual a copy of the report down the machine and not rely on the machine leader to do it. And then they would all huddle together and look at their copies of the report. Now that's a very practical, seems like maybe mundane example. But when I, as the plant manager, was trying to tell everybody what was going on, the barriers in between get in the way of the message even getting to the desk of the person who should know. Short of understanding what the message said. So those are the practical things that we have to deal with down this chain of organizational structure to get the right messages through.
Guy, I'm smiling as Bob tells the story, because the very first project I ever did for Bob was helping revise that very report, and I had forgotten about it till right now. It was to revise that very report, and it went back to the whole thing that Bob and I talked about, and we just talked about 5 minutes ago, was that you can say anything, but you can't say everything. And the original report it had everything in it. And so one of the first changes we made in the report was to cut down the amount of information, make it smaller. I think it was about 120 pages or so, if I recall, the first report, and then focus it around the core values of the organization. And I still show that to people today, because it's an example of trying not to say everything, but to say the right things that are going to have the most value.
I really like that. I'm also hearing something there about, again, just put me on the right track if I've not heard it correctly. There are some very visible things that you can do when you're a leader. There are also subtle practices as well. And I know you talk about that sort of idea of visible and subtle practices. I have a frame of reference for things which is symbolic acts, which is things that demonstrably show people that there might be change, for example. It'd be great for you to just bring that alive, because it'll either add to what others know about or course correct us.
Yes, that's really important ideas in the book, so it's great you are pointing that out. Each one of the practices in the second section we break down into what are the visible things that you can do and what are the subtle things that you can do to implement the practice. So let's take an example and stay in the communications area and talk about coaching of employees. So one of the very visible practices that leaders have to have is a practice of actually meeting with your employee on a one-on-one basis and having a great conversation, a coaching conversation, and make sure it's two ways, so you're listening to what they have to say and also talking about what you as the leader are interested in and wanting to be helping that person develop. So that's a visible practice. I'm going to schedule routine meetings. I'm going to have an agenda. I'm going to talk about things that are on your mind, things that are on my mind. A subtle practice is during those conversations. One of the things that would be on every employee's mind is how are they doing in their career? How are they doing with their job and with that particular job as it relates to how they see their future? And so I think it's important to start a dialogue with your people on a one-on-one basis of tell me about how this job is working for you within your aspirations for your career. What do you have as next ideas in your career? What's your ultimate goal in your career? And really be genuine and interested in what they have to say about that, and start to think about how you can structure assignments and help them get along on that path in their career. And we call that a subtle practice because it's not kind of like getting the objectives for the week or the month taken care of and out of the way. It's more personal to the individual, but it's so very important because all the things they do in their job every day build up to their performance and how that affects the next steps. So getting into conversations about career and career development as part of a coaching regime is a subtle practice that's very important for leaders. That would be one example.
I'm just going to move on then to, I think we spoke about it when we just first spoke. You referenced toxic positivity. That was quite key for me because I once worked with an organization that was run by an incredibly motivational leader, just in terms of his individual characteristics. And then it was taken over, the baton was handed over to somebody. They did something which I would call the happy clappy bus, where everybody had to be on the bus. But not that phrase, are you on the bus? But everything had to be in the positive. And that almost a lack of willingness to acknowledge anything that wasn't, not just on the bus, but super positive. Toxic positivity. I don't know if that's even referring to what I'm referring to, but I experienced it so profoundly that it meant that within a couple of years, this organization basically collapsed due to the fact that there was no bad news. So there was no learning, there were no honest conversations. So I'll just hand that baton over to you just to say, no, that's not what we're talking about, or yes, it is, but toxic positivity.
Yeah, well, that we came up with that in part because it fit perfectly what our approach was. And quite frankly, I had just finished interviewing 5 employees who quit organizations, literally while we were writing. And I started going into why they're quitting. And then we came up with this word toxic positivity because they had very much the same experience you had, where the leaders involved, it was happy talk all the time. And they would brook no conversation about potential problems or challenges they were having in their own job. even to the point of acknowledging it. And this is a classic example of where somebody had one skill set, which is to be encouraging and be, up, if you will, to be positive, but they didn't have the underlying belief structure that said, look, the way we make progress, which is one of the core beliefs is you have to acknowledge problems to move forward. And they just think that in each of those situations, the employees, the leaders were saying, basically, this is all about talking positive about everything and not acknowledging any problems. So it's a very shallow view of what a good workplace is really like. Every workplace, and everybody knows that there are problems in a workplace. You can always get better. So I never understood why an employer or a leader would say, why not talk about it? I'll give you one specific example. I was asked to speak in front of a group of business leaders for the university once. And the dean at the time and the person at the time said, Phil, I want you to go on, but I don't want you to say anything negative. He says, I know you're into, basically said, I know you're into continuous improvement, but don't say anything negative because we want to impress these people. And I came in and thought just the opposite. I said, I'm going to tell them what we do well, but I'm going to tell them what our challenges are. And when I started doing that and saying, and this is how we're addressing the problems, when I started doing that, it was no longer quote unquote happy talk. Every business leader in that room shook their head and said, you're the first guy who's come up here and been truthful with us about what's going on. And of course, they ended up being bigger donors than some of than the other people, because they realized that not every organization is perfect. So I don't know why you can't, and I think it comes down to this. They think that that good leadership is people saying good things all the time about the organization, as opposed to saying good leadership and effective leadership and in great organizations are constantly solving the problems that come up and challenges that come up and seizing those opportunities to make progress. And I think that's a different shift in mindset from basically a PR happy talk kind of approach, which says, we're just going to say great things about everything, as opposed to saying we've added acknowledging that the problems, but the competency and the enthusiasm and the excitement comes from solving and resolving those problems in a quick way. So I actually think toxic positivity long term can really stifle the organization's innovation, stifle the enthusiasm, and in the case that I just started with, cause good people to leave because they know it's not real. And that really undermines the organization. And then all of a sudden, what seems like a darling organization just falls off the cliff because all the good people have left because none of the problems have been solved or challenges have been seized.
I mean, people want to hear the good news, but they want to hear the bad news. They know there's bad news, and they know immediately if the bad news is being stifled because they can feel it. And a leader has to be balanced in that, and it has to be okay to talk about what's going wrong. I worked for a guy for a number of years who'd come in my office once or twice a week, and the first thing he'd say is, what are our problems today? Tell me your problems. He wanted to know that first. And the message there was he wanted to legitimize and make it safe to talk about the things that were going wrong. And then you can talk about the things that are going well. And you have to have this comfort in being able to express the problems and articulate what needs to be improved transparently and honestly to people, because they know it anyway. They feel it anyway. And you get a lot of credibility as a leader if you legitimize the idea that there are problems and there are also good things that are going on.
I think the other piece of the guy that comes down is sometimes I think toxic positivity occurs because people don't want to acknowledge the uncertainty, and they think their role as a leader is to have all the answers. And so I always view, and they think it undermines the credibility if you indicate uncertainty that you don't know, or B, there's a problem. I always go back to meteorologists. I always say, well, how does a meteorologist maintain credibility when they get the forecast wrong? from time to time, or they can't predict in the future. But we still watch them because they're communicating constantly and they're out there correcting things as they occur. And so one of the challenges I would throw out to a leader is think of yourself more as a meteorologist rather than somebody who's up on the stage orating and saying these are all the great answers to all the problems or whatever, and everything's going great. So I think that's more of a model for leadership today.
I don't know how it was in the UK, but I mean, I think this is at the center of some of the challenges beyond the technical challenges, but some of the challenges that the US faced in the pandemic in terms of what caused it, how are we doing, are the vaccines effective, should everybody have one? All of those questions that were expressed with such certainty by the people who then had to get information walked back because new information came out and it wasn't supporting the old theories. Well, that created a lot of cynicism even today in how things were handled. And just how the communication strategy worked for that could have been done much better by legitimizing the things that people knew and what they didn't know, what they were more certain of and less certain of, and what was developing information. And that is the kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about effective or robust communication with an audience.
And there's something very real about trust in the world at the moment. Reference the Edelman Trust Barometer, which says trust globally in all areas is down and probably has been for the last few years. So to be in a workplace and to look around and go, do I trust the banks? Do I trust the church? Do I trust, or whatever my religion is, do I trust social media? Now, actually, in some respects, if you're in a position of authority, one could argue that the odds are slightly stacked against you, because all the other indicators are that if you're in a position of potential power, you're not to be trusted. It's interesting that I may say that back in the day, if your doctor gave you a diagnosis, you accepted it. Now you ask them how to spell it and Google it because you're not sure whether or not you're going to trust what they've told you. There's a shift, I think, in people's relationship with positional power. So I think what I'm hearing from you there is legitimizing what people already know is an indicator to people that you are to be trusted because it's right in front of us. We can all see it. At least acknowledge that that's true, and then the harder messages might be more palatable as well and easier to digest because ultimately you've already proven that the stuff that's in plain sight, we're okay to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly right. And the dynamic is even more complicated than that because for people who want to know what the real answer is, they might question the doctor's diagnosis and Google it and come up with their own path forward. But they want a degree of certainty as to what they're going to do. So they strive to get information from leaders as to what the answer is. I mean, the great example of that is when there's a homicide that's complicated and there's no one that's been found as the perpetrator, and the investigation goes on and on and on, and it's almost the pressure of anyone who's found will do, just so we find someone who we can blame, whether it's the right one or not, because people want the certainty of a certain answer. There has to be some tolerance for not being able to have all the answers all the time. And that has to do with how leaders communicate about it, but also has to do with how people are willing to accept the fact that you can't have answers for everything immediately. So that dichotomy, that tension is constantly in front of leaders, and managing that correctly has a lot to do with how people will feel about the leader's credibility.
Yeah, I also think that it goes back in part to that meteorology example, that there's a balance between trusting the answers and trusting the process. And the objective of establishing the credibility of the leader, I think, lies more in creating trust in the process, that we may not have it completely right now, but we're going to get it right over time. And so as the conditions get closer to the day where the storm is going to show up, we're far more certain than we are 5, 6, 7, 8 days out. So we may not have the answer now. We have a partial answer, what we think is an answer, but we trust the process. So we'll continue to pay attention to the communication. The real tragedy, of course, occurs when somebody has provided certainty and it doesn't work out, and the answers do not work out, and you distrust the entire process and anything coming out of that person's mouth, and you completely destroyed credibility. So striking that balance is really a mind shift orientation to say, I want you to trust the process, and I want you to trust the answer that we have today, with the idea that we might change that answer as new facts and new perspectives emerge.
And this brings me probably into my final question, which is, I think a lot of the things that I've heard you talk about sit around this idea of maybe people seek certainty. That's why we establish certain protocols and processes and mindsets, because I think there's an inherent desire for stability. And so this idea of embracing uncertainty, and I don't know if that's just about from a startup to a long-term organization, but why is it difficult to turn that phrase, embracing uncertainty, I should say? Why is that hard for people, especially when they're probably being consistently asked, make a process that makes it certain? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the reason why, part of that's, that's what the kind of, I would say, the first level of naive expectations about leadership is that they want certainty, and who wouldn't want certainty? Because then you can plan exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to respond to it. So I think in part, we all crave that to a certain level. But the question is where do you get that certainty from? And the certainty, in my view, comes from the process. Good leadership comes from the process rather than from the answer. And so I think that is at the core of it. And I'm not enough of a psychologist. I've studied it a lot to know why we all crave that. But there are some certainties in life, and we have to deal with those. But in between, we crave those, I think, in a certain extent. But on the other hand, we enjoy uncertainty. I'll share you one quick statistic about this. When we started looking at this whole issue of uncertainty, what was absolutely fascinating, Guy, was we did a study, and we came up, I think we had a couple thousand employees or something, and we found that, to go back to the uncertainty, and the craving of it, even if somebody personally, that is in their own life, tended more towards wanting to have certainty, the employees who were most satisfied, most committed to their organizations, wanted their organizations to embrace uncertainty. So when you're looking at your own personal life, you want some degree of certainty. So we're talking about some government bureaucrats, they love the certainty of what they're doing. But even then, they wanted organizations that were embracing uncertainty. So I think another, if you want to take another angle on this, would be to say, one of the ways we resolve uncertainty and deal with that sense of the unease that we all have with uncertainty is by having a collective group of people try to grapple with it. And that helps people feel more comfortable that at the very least, I'm going to have this group here helping me deal with the uncertainty and work through that. And that's how, if you think back, to World War I, World War II, all the wars that are going on, how did great units survive amidst the uncertainty? They survived by holding together as a team that embraces the uncertainty, but they have the certainty that their brother and the person that they're in the foxhole with, so to speak, is there to protect them as for amongst all those uncertainties that surround them.
We're all, if you think about this also from an individual point of view, we're all trained to give answers to questions, right? Our whole education system is built around learning something and then The instructor asks you to stand up and give the right answers to the questions that they're asking, or the right answers on the test. The right answers, the certain answers to the questions. And that's so ingrained in us, and in organizations, employees look to the leaders as the people who, quote, have the answers. And so when it's not acceptable to stand up, when you're in 8th grade and say, well, that's a nice question, but I don't know the answer. You'll get a bad grade if you do that. It's not acceptable to many employees for the leader to stand up in front and say, I don't know the answer to your question. But it should be more acceptable than it is, and the leader has to communicate in a way that says, that question is important. We only have a partial answer to the question you're asking. We have a process, as Phil said, to look at the rest of the answer and a group of people who are working on it, and we will keep you up to date on the progress. And ultimately, 3 months from now, we'll have a better answer than we have today. That has to become more of an acceptable thought process in organizations to be more transparent and honest about the information that we know and that we don't know.
But Guy, I think you ask a really important question. Where does that certainty mindset come from? And I think Bob put his finger on it. I think, at least here in the United States, a lot of our educational systems is built around providing the certain, quote unquote, right answer. And I'm in a college classroom every day, and I have to break through that, even when I'm talking with juniors, seniors, and graduate students. And to build that kind of mindset is something that, A, I don't think people know how to do very well, and B, certainly haven't practiced it enough to feel confident in their ability to manage it. And one of the brilliant things about Bob's leadership style has been that he builds confidence in teams that allow them to embrace uncertainty, which is why the companies grow.
Well, gentlemen, I've said this a lot recently with guests, and it definitely applies to the two of you. You're lucky I don't live nearby, because I'd just come and sit next to you and ply you with drink and good food and keep you talking. So, but I'm super alert to the listening span of a listener. So I'm going to bring us to an end. I think this has been really insightful. I think there's a real sense of clarity in your thinking, and it's quite clear that it's built on a depth of understanding that I know we're only touching on lightly here. So leading with care in a tough world beyond servant leadership, I will definitely put the connection to that goes with the podcast. And I guess just in closing, I just want to thank you for your insight, and thank you for taking the time to come on this episode. I think it will be very, very valuable for people, and I'm definitely going to advocate that people take an interest in what you've written and what you're about. So from me and from the listeners, I'm going to get you to stay on for a few moments just to make sure everything's loaded up. But just thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. Thank you.
Well, Guy, thank you so much for having us. We've enjoyed it very much. It's been a great hour with you. We'd love to have you closer so we could do it more often. And happy to do it more often if you find people interested.
I think that could happen.
Guy, I just want to thank you, because you are one of the first people who's really exposed the shift in thinking. Your questions are brilliant because they allow us to expose the underlying thinking, and it's hard to kind of get to that, but the way we interacted with one another is kind of cool, because we saw the shift in thinking that I think is in line with what you believe, and exposing that and talking about that is a really big challenge, because we don't have good language to talk about it right now and no ready-made phrases. But you, between all the three of us, we've been able to expose some of that. So thank you very much for the time.
No, my absolute pleasure. So I'm going to press the stop button and stay on for a few more moments. Thank you. That's it, so I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness, and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.